Good morning and welcome to our fourth space series of interdisciplinary conversations, today focused largely on cities, urban planning, and transportation. We are delighted that you could join us and extend a warm welcome to all attendees and of course our in-house experts, the panelists from whom you'll hear today. Thank you for leading this conversation. We have a very large group with us today, so we'll do our best to attend to as many questions as possible that pop into the Q&A. And those of you tuned into the Facebook live stream will share your comments with our panelists as well. Leading today's conversation, acting as both moderator and panelist, it's my very great pleasure to invite Associate Professor in the Department of Geography, Planning, and Environment, Dr. Zachary Patterson, to take the floor and introduce today's discussion. Over to you, Zach.
Thanks very much, Anna. Hello, Internet. Hello, world. Thanks for the invitation, Anna, from Fourth Space and from the university to host this webinar. I think it'll be very interesting. My name is Zach Patterson. Anna already introduced me. I'm a professor in the Department of Urban Planning at Concordia University. And today we're going to be talking about cities and COVID and transportation and planning, a number of different issues around that. In order to do that, we've got a star panel here, and I'll let them just try to see the order that I've got them in. I've got the order of them on my screen. I'd like to let them introduce themselves. We'll start with Megan Joy, but we have Megan Joy, Axel Watanabe, and Pierre Gauthier. Megan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, for sure. So I am an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science here at Concordia. And I study and teach in the area of urban politics and urban policy. And what particularly interests me research-wise is really how cities are adapting to demographic changes with respect to population aging. Thanks.
And next up we have Axel Watanabe.
All right. Well, thanks, Zach, and thank you for the staff member at Fourth Space for inviting me. I'm assistant professor at economics department at Concordia, and I joined the department 2 years ago. I'm urban economist by training, and right now I'm studying the mobility of people and how far we move to get a new job, for example, which probably is one of the interesting topic, because right now we are definitely thinking about the mobility, especially when we have this stay in shelter order. So hopefully we can share some of, I can share some of my findings with you guys today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Axel. Now we'll move on to Pierre to introduce himself.
Yes, Pierre Gauthier. I'm an associate professor at the Department of Geography, Planning, and Environment. I'm teaching physical planning, so which connects urban form, transportation, and land use. And my specialty revolves around the evolution of urban forms and the material cultures, and the in longer historical terms, but also, like it's the impacts on the present.
Thanks very much, Pierre. Now I'm gonna kind of launch the discussion. I'm going to give a little bit of context, and then I have a few questions that I'm hoping that you'll ask. I'm sure we'll have questions from the audience as well. But in order to get the conversation rolling, the way I see it when I was asked to think about this question is that cities themselves, they exist, obviously they exist, they emerge almost, primarily because of the advantages that people and firms derive in being located close to each other. Within a city, we have specialists in many different fields. The larger the city is, the more specialized people can be. And these people converge and contribute their skills to different industries in a way that would otherwise be impossible if they lived very far from each other. So the city allows many different people to interact with each other. Ideally, or one of the reasons that we think contributes to the importance of cities and the reason that they exist, is that there's a sense that the people, the experts, people who are particularly specialized within a region, are able to do tasks that they're particularly good at. And there are jobs out there requiring people with special skills. And the larger the city is, the more specialized people are, the better able you are to get a match between a particular specialization and expertise and the jobs that need to be done. And this is really what accounts. So it accounts for two things. One, it accounts for why cities are so productive, And it also accounts for why cities themselves exist, the forces that come to hold a city, to lead to city formation and to have cities exist and pull together after that. In fact, it leads to all kinds of things that we recognize in cities. So we'll typically have dense, compact urban cores. It's not the same in every city, but every city's downtown will have maybe more dense and compact than the outskirts. There's high land values. These are characteristics that everyone, I think, can appreciate that we find in cities. With COVID, things have changed a fair bit. Our everyday life has transformed as an attempt to control the outbreak. And a lot of activities like this one here have moved online. And so there's a lot of the impacts of what's been done to try to control COVID-19 has been to work against these forces that drive cities to be dense and concentrated. For decades, the dominant academic planning paradigm has sought to encourage people to live in central, dense neighborhoods where they're more likely to travel using sustainable transportation modes. And what I've been seeing in discussions and in my life feed as things go by is that there's a distinct concern among planners because of COVID-19, or fearful maybe that COVID-19, or as a result of COVID-19, people will rely more on individual travel modes, and notably the car. It's also at least possible that the current situation could make people wary of public transportation even after the health concern has passed. Similarly, there seem to be concerns that people will not be as tied to work locations as they have in the past. They can do things by Zoom now, and that support for anti-density planning will gain new life, further working against the forces that drive cities to be too dense and concentrated. So with that backdrop, I'd like to ask each of you, and I think you can comment in the same way that we did the introduction. So that would be Megan, Axel, and then Pierre, about what you think about these concerns that that planners are having in the long term and after COVID-19 has faded away.
Thanks, Zach. So I guess my first thought in kind of teasing out some of the elements of your question is what kinds of perhaps biases and assumptions about the very definition of economic development might be made sort of invisible, and what is being made visible now, right? Like, so cities are complex organisms, urban economies are complex organisms. And I think there's an importance of not just sort of focusing on the high-end service economy of large cities, right? And of those industries that are best able to move online. I mean, we as professors are in one of them, right? And workers that are best able to move online, right? Or right, that have, we're middle and upper class. We have better access to safe and adequate housing, to the internet, to technology, to unions that are fighting for our rights, right? And cities in many ways in their urban planning is set to really cater to this kind of 9 to 5 workforce. And we can think about that in terms of public transit and its routing and where stops are located and whatnot, right? And I think, there's been a lot of focus in academia on this high end of the service economy as well. I'm thinking about Saskia Sassen's sort of global city, and she sort of refutes the notion that the technological revolution is actually flattening cities, and cities have become more important because they in very many ways agglomerate this sort of high end of the economy, right? The PR firms, the large headquarters. And in fact, public policy, urban public policy has been trying to kind of get those firms to come to their cities, right? We're thinking about kind of like trying to get Amazon to come in here. And I think when I answer this question, I sort of want to shift the conversation a bit to think about the concept of the ordinary city. This is Jennifer Robinson's concept, and kind of thinking about how academics and also governments also need to think about the rest of the local economy, right? The working class jobs, the more place-based jobs in the food sector, the healthcare sector, for instance, because I think COVID has made these very visible, how visible and essential these sectors, these jobs, and these workers are to a city's functioning and very survival, right? And I think in urban planning, we haven't been focusing nearly enough on these workers, on their safety, on their wages, and also the way that they live in cities, right? Because these are often low-wage jobs, workers are not always able to afford housing near their workplace. They tend to live in neighborhoods that agglomerate affordable housing, right? They tend to use public transit more often, and often at odd hours, and sometimes at hours when public transit isn't even available, right? And we're seeing COVID-19 infection rates higher in these neighborhoods, right? And we can think about Montréal Nord as an example here. And I think this encourages us to think about, cities as places that also agglomerate care and kind of the care industry, right? And jobs in this sector as well that can't be moved online that easily. And so I think we need to think about these in urban planning a lot more. The location of hospitals, long-term care facilities, shelters, food banks, and we need to think about who's accessing those services and also the workers as well and how they live and operate in the city. So I have more to say, but I'm going to leave it at that because I've taken up too much time so far.
I don't think you have taken up too much time, Megan. I thought that was very interesting, actually. And I'm just gonna quickly follow up with one question because I think it's related to the question that I was asking. I think it's absolutely true that there are all kinds of jobs. I like the term that you use, place-based. They're very difficult to not become place-based, to be moved online. And so related to them, what do you think the impact will be in the long term of COVID? Will there be any impact on those jobs and where they're located, or if they'll just go back to, you know, business as usual?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're starting to see already movements around thinking about increasing wages in these particular jobs and thinking about where workers are located and whatnot as well. So I think that's a really important I guess, shift or thinking that I think as urban planners and policymakers really need to take into account as well, right? And also, and I was going to talk about this a little bit more in a second as this relates to urban planning, but really thinking about the concept of like complete communities and complete neighborhoods, and in urban planning, thinking about the social planning element to that and making sure that there are sort of long-term care facilities, hospitals, different types of social care facilities available in neighborhoods that also have affordable housing located in them.
Okay, good. Thanks. Let's move on to Axel. What do you have to say about all this?
Yes, Zach. Just picking up on Megan's idea of social planning here. Let me just step back a little bit and to give everyone some background as to how urban economists think about designing the good transportation system, economic system before and after pandemics. Let me just go ahead and share my screen with you. All right. So I prepared some basic fundamental exercise to show you how urban economists think about this pandemic, and then what can we say moving forward regarding the new urban landscape here. So let's say, imagine that you are working for the airliner, for example, and then planning to install a network. I use cities as an example, but it works on the city level as well. So I'm just going to use this for now. So let's say that you have 2 airplanes serving your potential 5 cities that you are going to serve. One way to configure your network is called point-to-point. So you're going to use one airplane to serve between Chicago and Quebec, and another one to serve St. Louis and Boston, down and back. And another way to connect cities or connect people in Montreal, for example, is just use one airplane, fly from Quebec to Montreal, and then onward to Chicago. And then use another airplane to fly in from Boston and then fly out into St. Louis. And then, so as Zach alluded to at the beginning, the right line is called hub and spoke system. So you have high concentration of airplanes coming in Montreal, which can be represented by the number of pairs of cities that you can serve. So if you go for point-to-point network, the number of pairs, of cities you can serve is going to be just 2. So that's probably small. But if you go for hub and spoke system, then it's going to be 5 choose 2. So you can serve 10 pairs. So that's definitely the benefit, sort of agglomeration force that clusters activities in Montreal. But then, of course, there's always this dispersion force pulling people away from concentration. So one way to figure that is just to look at the congestion. Now, if you have point-to-point, there's no congestion here. But if you use the hub and spoke system, then you have to coordinate your arrival time and departure time in Montreal so that it actually works. So you have to face, then that's going to impose some stress on the limited capacity at Montreal. So it's always the trade-off between pros and cons here.
Axel, should the congestion, should it be a frowny face for the hub and spoke?
Yeah, thank you, Zach. I put them backwards. So point to point, yeah, there's no congestion, great. But for hub and spoke, so for example, the landing slot, the price gets choked up because so many airplanes are coming in at the same time, for example. So how do we factor in this the novel coronavirus into this picture? Way I think about this is it's another negative that is added onto this network structure here. And in pathology, they use this R number, which is reproduction number. So that's roughly the number of people that the one virus carrier infects. So if it's greater than 1, then the number of cases are going to go up exponentially. So that's why we have stay in shelter order so that we can reduce the number below 0. Now, once the R number hits below 1, then if the number hits below 1, then the virus just peter out on its own. So that's great. Now, for the sake of argument, let's say that we have 2 passengers, Axel, traveling from Boston to St. Louis, and then another passenger, Zach, traveling from Quebec to Chicago here. All right, now here you have point-to-point network. And then for the sake of argument, let's say that I have virus, but asymptomatic, and the Zach doesn't have the virus. Now if we travel in this way, point-to-point, I fly from Boston to St. Louis, Zach flies from Quebec to Chicago, that's it. So our number is going to be 0. So that's great because our path didn't cross. So I can't infect that. So that's great. But go for a hub and spoke system, it's a disaster because I'm going to fly from Boston to Montreal and then Zach. So Zach and I are going to meet in Montreal. So probably the R number is going to be 1 because I have only 1 person to infect. But imagine that there are a bunch of Zachs in this system, then it's going to be greater than 1. So here are actually virus designing the network structure, then hub and spoke network is actually the best case scenario for the virus, meaning that it's the worst case scenario for us. So these days, so I think we have to put a little bit more weight towards this negativity now that we have pandemic in place. And then, so Zach said, yeah, probably we are going to use more point-to-point travel, i.e. the use of cars. But so that's probably, it might increase the carbon footprint, for example. But then at the same time, Montreal is ramping up the investment to make more bike lanes. That's another way to have point-to-point network. So we don't probably have to be too pessimistic about the, getting back to the point-to-point system. There's environmental sustainable way to do so. So hopefully that kind of helped everyone to put everyone in the same page. And I will give this back to you, Zach.
I did a little manipulation there, it didn't work. Okay, good. All right, thanks, Axel. Yeah, that's I liked, thanks for using me in your example. I've always wanted to be used in an example. Pierre, what do you have to say about Axel and Megan's comments? And any other comments you have?
More generally, yeah, they're very interesting, and they touch on aspects that I wish to address as well. They're at the core of the problem, and as a matter of fact, like Axel's illustration or demonstration, could be applied to urban transportation and could lead to similar, questioning, and then we can wonder, like what will be the answer, the collective answer, and the policy answer, to go back to Megan, and while keeping in mind that we need to address, like complexity, so this is a little link, like that I can make with my colleagues' perspectives, but I'd like to, when trying to considering the present and the future as teaching, planning, and, to put things into historical perspective. So pandemics is not a new reality. It's not a new urban reality. Obviously we can go back to Middle Ages, we can go back to plagues and so on. But if we go back to 19th century, cholera, for instance, was a major pandemics, that had dire consequences and so on, like much harsher than what we experience right now. And there were two answers, in terms of designs of cities and planning of cities to cholera in particular. Like one is continental, I would characterize as mostly continental Europe response. And Haussmannian Paris is the best example of that. It's the most, like famous, and it's an example that was emulated in other cities. So it consisted in rebuilding Paris from within. Like, of course, those were autocratic times, and the political circumstances allowed for it. But by, like opening very large boulevards in Paris, for instance, by investing massively in public works for new sewage systems, water works, was even, that's planned by Haussmann to deploy hospital, like across Paris, which wasn't done in the end, but that was part of the scheme, and large parks, as a way, because we thought that full air was, like because of the diffusion of diseases, and then eventually we understand that water was more, like the culprit here. In the Anglo-Saxon world, I think that the response was basically accelerated a movement towards the periphery for those who could afford. So that movement started earlier, like the bourgeoisie moving out of the city center, and which entailed a disconnect between the work sphere and the domestic sphere. So the families would be moved towards the periphery, but the businesses would stay, like in the center, and it marks the transition from the cottage industry to other economic production system. But in the Anglo-Saxon world as well, like the building of large parks, the parks and boulevard movements, which connects those, like to the Haussmannian experience, like is something that we witness. So, for example, like Olmsted in Montreal. Well, Olmsted was the landscape architect who designed Central Park in New York, but also Montreal Park in Montreal, did believe and advocated for the construction of big parks that would allow to heal, like the social body, so they thought about, like the healing virtues of nature, generally speaking. It was a 19th century thought that I found naive, but now there are new scientific evidences backing up such a belief, if you wish. But so this is, so cities transform. And in Montreal, similarly, as a response to the cholera, the Anglo-Saxon elite, in particular the merchant, like moved to the slopes of Montreal, like in what is known as the Golden Square Mile sector, nearby, between basically Concordia and McGill University campus. So this movement towards a suburb tried to, fly from a flight, like from the threats caused by central city, of all nature, like moral, health, and so on and so forth, certainly funneled the suburbanization movement. What I want to stress, and want to discuss, and that might be my contribution here, is that now it's evident that the sprawling of cities, the rampant suburbanization, what we mean by sprawl is a distribution of population and activities on a very large territories, which had to be accompanied, was facilitated, if you wish, by the adoption of individual cars, individual transportation, pose, and this is undeniable, a far greater threat to human health than the concentration of people in cities. So if we need to keep that in mind, because of the destruction of the ecosystems, because of the ability to ecosystems to respond and help cope, like with the consequences of climate change, the unrolling consequences of urban change and so on and so forth, because of the energy consumption, fossil energy consumption to start with, but the destruction of ecosystems and reduction of biomass also translates into, like negative carbon, like in the balance sheet, when all things is considered. So it increases the vulnerabilities at all sorts of level, including social, psychological, and so on, that could be discussed. And including, like in terms of, because of social isolation, because of lack of exercise, because of, like reduced ability to connect with the greater communities and so on. And those are, in my mind, far greater threats. And I hope that we will keep that in mind, like in the discussion that will follow the current COVID, punctual crisis, though very, very significant. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Pierre. Quick add-on question. So I think you think it would be better that planning didn't take too much account or change, say, zoning to encourage de-densification. But do you think that in the long term, it would be likely to happen?
We don't know the future. The forces that propel suburbanization are complex. There are, massive economic interests at play. Like it's evident for a lot of people in the field, that this is a model that is doomed, and despite that, there are still, these forces are still, at play, individual automobile and so on. Going electric is not the solution, but this could be presented as a quick fix and so on and so forth. So those forces are still there shaping the future somehow. And I hope that, like the COVID will require that we adjust our behavior and so on and so forth. But I hope that it will not become a pretext, if you wish, to unleash, or to let those forces to continue to unfold, as they did in the past 60 or 70 years. That would be, that would lead to a much greater threat, which is already present, which is climate change, associated with climate change. But I don't know the future,
Okay, yeah, I can't expect you to know the future, but I thought it was interesting all the same to get your perspective on it. So there's a bunch of questions that are coming in the Q&A. It's a little bit different than I imagined things. So this is very exciting, and it's I'm trying to manage it a little bit. There's one very precise question for you, Axel, I think, that would help feed another discussion topic that came up in the Q&A. So there's a question from Jean-François Quentin, and he asks, could hub and spoke apply to transit? And I think that was your intention, but it'd be good if you could clarify that.
Sure, of course. And yeah, I think that's a good question. Hold on, let me just put this back. Oh. All right, so I use the cities as an example, but of course you can think of this at this within the kind of intra-city level. So STM, take STM for example. Now they use this typical hub and spoke system. So for example, this can be Guy Concordia, for example, and then lots of buses are going to terminate in or start from these stations. So you have lots of bus feeding this station here, right? And then most of the subways go through Berry-UQAM. So Montreal, in this example, is going to be actually Berry-UQAM. And they imagine that the one person is actually infected here. Then he's going to spread in here, and then he can travel further down, and then lots of infection can happen here. So he sticks to the hub and spoke system. So I will just put the skull and bone here. So the hub can be actually epicenter, and then it actually helps the virus disseminate even farther than necessary here. So hub and spoke is even at within the city level. During the peacetime, it's great. Remember that you have 2 airplanes or 2 subway trains, for example, and then still you can reach out to 10 pairs rather than 2. So there is certain benefit to it. But during the crisis like this, then probably we might have to rethink the way we think about the benefit of hub and spoke, and probably we might want to back down from hub and spoke and then design more towards point-to-point system. And I know that London and Paris, for example, they are also ramping up the investment towards, for example, pedestrian paths or bike lanes, for example. So they acknowledge that hub and spoke network is probably not the best thing to install during the crisis. And we are kind of moving towards point-to-point to some extent. Like Zachary alluded to, there's always trade-offs there. But I think we are going to shift from this hub and spoke to more towards point-to-point, at least during the crisis is over. Hope that answered your question.
Okay, thanks, Axel. There's another question that's related to public transportation that builds a little bit on this. There's a question asking, what happens when large urban occupiers are currently reevaluating significant proportions of office portfolios, apparently 30 to 50% as a result of COVID to increase work from home capacity? So Mark Zuckerberg apparently has publicly said, I've heard this too actually, that publicly said what occupiers are planning, what Facebook is thinking about. So what would be the implications on public transportation, short or long term, of these kinds of decisions? I think you all have probably something to say about that. We can, would you like to start, Megan?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, I think this is really interesting. I mean, I think, again, I guess I come back to this concept of thinking about when we're looking at kind of the need for the hub and spoke model and the point-to-point model, it comes back down to kind of urban planning and how we're integrating work and our jobs and where we live and our access to recreation and leisure and all the things that we need within a fairly close proximity, right? Because we've built our cities in such a way, and this relates to what Pierre was talking about with this sprawl, right? Is that is that a lot of the time someone will be living, actually outside of the municipality, right, in the regional area, and will be commuting in from that area to the central business district. And I think this is going to be challenged, and we're seeing this kind of already, right? So I think there will be this need to kind of think about kind of the reuse of urban space in different neighborhoods, and thinking about kind of planning neighborhoods and that kind of a complete community. I don't know if anybody's heard of the concept of the 15-minute city. Again, it's been discussed in the context of the Paris elections, but this notion of kind of creating holistic neighborhoods where everyone should be able to get to all the necessities that they need to survive and thrive within a 15-minute commute by bicycle, but I think it's a 30-minute kind of commute by walk, right? And so this gets us to thinking about all the different things that folks are going to need in the neighborhood and how to mix these things, right? How to mix access to work, to food, thinking about food justice in our neighborhoods, to social services, to recreation. And I think here we're going to be thinking about more flexible and mixed forms of zoning, right? Having retail at grade at the first floor, and perhaps, offices on the second floor, and perhaps living spaces upstairs, right? Or thinking about how to have, childcare at grade in a long-term care facility. These types of different kinds of things about mixing. And then, we're going to have to think about transit money being rerouted to different forms of active transportation and away from this kind of, designing transit from the suburbs to kind of get into the inner city. So there's all kinds of policy thinking that needs, I think, to happen here around shifts with that.
Thanks, Megan. I think we're going to go with you, Pierre, next. I think your comments will be able to feed and build on Megan's more directly than Axel. We'll hear from Axel afterwards.
Yeah, but I think the two are linked, like we understand the need to turn at least, temporarily to point rather than hubs and so on, and to think of the system in such terms, or at least to think of the possibility to retrofitting the system, according to that model temporarily when the crisis But what Megan pointed to is super important, and it's that doesn't need to lead to atomization, to everybody leaving in a very dispersed way and moving in their own bubble all around, which is the real threat associated, because of the environmental consequences of this mode of living, right? And so there are alternative models. where those two apparently, like opposing realities could be combined, in new ways. And I think that this is a very, very important point. That's key, but if you, the problem is that, like the forces that shape, the way in which we live are not, like focusing on such, and they're not, like the economic interests behind them are not necessarily like advocating for this type of transformation, or wouldn't benefit, at least, like initially from this type of transformation. But this is very, those are very important points.
Thanks, Pierre. Would you like to follow up, Axel?
Sure. So let me actually share my screen again. So this is actually one of the first models I teach in my urban class. So there's a model called Monocentric city model dating back to 1960s. So what it does is it predicts the land use pattern within a given city. So we assume that there's one employment center, for example, downtown Montreal, and then the population just spreads towards the suburbs. And so I just picked 3 parameters here, variables here, to kind of show you how we can use some of the tools to control or direct the population density to the way like Megan addressed here. So I'm going to just share with you what the urban economics has to say about this. So let's just stay focused on the solid line here. So commuting cost is this red line here. So what it so as you move farther away from the city center, it's going to cost you a lot more to commute in the city center. And so the question this model addresses is why there's no big houses near the city center, and then why there's not so many high density residential area in the suburbs. Well, the answer is, once again, there's a trade-off here. So if you live in the city center, then you will save on a lot in commuting. And if you live in the suburbs, it's going to cost you a lot. So to compensate for the increasing transportation costs in the suburbs, land use tends to be low density. So as you can see, the population density gradually drops towards the suburbs. Otherwise, everybody wants to live in the city center. So that's how we, within the city, people kind of level out. So if you want to save on the commuting cost, then you have to live with small city center location with high rent. And if you want to have large area, then you have to live in the suburbs because the benefit from having large house needs to be compensated some way, and that's going to be high transportation costs here, right? So right now the idea is the population density and how we manage this. One thing we can do is actually to control the distance by way of differentiating the transportation costs. So this dotted line that I prepared here, this is a case when we increase the transportation costs, in which case what's going to happen is, as you can see, the population density actually goes up near the city center and then drops here because it costs more to commute. So although the land size, the housing size is small near the city center, but the people are willing to live in a cramped high density configuration because transportation cost is going to be high. So one thing we can do to address the density issues is to use the transportation cost as a political intervention tool so that we can disseminate or increase the population density across the city. And of course, there's other tools like exclusionary zoning. So for that, probably Megan is more suited to address these political interventions here.
All right, thanks very much, Axel. So I'm trying to figure out what the best way to go ahead here. I think we'll take one more question from the audience for now. Which is also related, and it's related in this case to transportation and some of the issues that have come up. So the question is, will post-COVID urban planning prioritize permanently pedestrianization of city centers or of cities? Who would like to take a first crack at that? If anyone.
Again, there's another question which speaks about, like urban parks and whether or not, like through land use and through, as an answer, does COVID, for instance, could it trigger revisiting, like our models to and to prioritize the construction, the introduction of green spaces in the compact cities and so on and so forth. So in my mind, those are related questions. It is for the same way that, like maybe we need systems that would allow to shift to point, like movement and so on. And as a matter of fact, if those point-to-point movement could be done by foot or by bike, then you have a part of the solution right there, But that's only feasible, in both circumstances, in a more compact urban form. Similarly, and keeping in mind those economic conditions that were described, by Axel, and I would suggest that, like such models should also internalize the social and environmental costs, like in those different configuration. But even keeping that in mind, yes, we see right now how important it is to allow people to be able to go out safely and walk and go around, like for their essential needs, but just also to be able to respite and get out of their apartments and so on and so forth. So yes, we need to retrofit cities, to be able to cope with such circumstances, especially when this retrofitting makes perfect sense from an environmental point of view, because ultimately what we want is to increase not only the safety of the population, but the quality of life and the health conditions, in the longer term, that could also be transformed, like, or translated in economic terms if we wish, So yes, retrofitting city, reclaiming space that is currently used for individual transportation to introduce more green spaces, to, like reduce which, by the way, reduce the heat island effect, or the extra heat that is generated by the mineral, like elements in the city. We could increase the quality of life. We could create conditions that are safe, in periods of crisis, and more broadly, for people could go out, like and like go, and meet and safely and so on and so forth. So we need to develop systems that could address both, those punctual crises, if you wish, and the broader context, that we're facing and challenges that we're facing. And there are solutions, and some of those are win-win, like to use this this expression. Yes.
Okay, thanks very much, Pierre. Have either Axel or Megan any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it raises this really interesting question around access in the suburbs as well. I mean, and what we've been seeing too is that as housing becomes less and less affordable in the inner city, some folks are being pushed into the suburbs because housing is actually more affordable there, right? So I think that we also need to sort of problematize the suburbs and take that kind of lens to things as well. And I think, when we're talking about moving to a pedestrianization, it's like, it might be just nice to kind of go for a walk, but it's also, walking to a place, walking to get your groceries, walking to, the recreation center or the library. And we're able to do that perhaps in inner cities. We're not really able to do that in the suburbs, right? And so I think it raises these kinds of questions about urban planning in the suburbs, and how do we kind of create maybe this notion of the 15-minute city in the suburbs. Like that's a model that's going to work in a downtown Paris or downtown Montreal, perhaps obviously a lot better than out into the suburbs, right? And so I think that raises a lot of questions. And also as a political scientist, it's coming at what's the politics that would not want to see density in the suburbs and would not want to see more building in the suburbs, right? And what are the kinds of tensions and conflicts that could exist there? So I think there's a lot of thinking that needs to be done on that too when we think about retrofitting.
How about you, Axel? Would you have anything to add?
Okay, so one thing I have, the discussion is based on the fact that probably, in a sense, the pandemic kind of triggered us to overcome the distance. Everything is happening online, in which case we can be anywhere. I could be Spain right now, for example. But then something that I discovered in the past couple of months is that actually people probably have not overcome the distance yet. So let me share one thing with you guys. So here, this is the map of the United States, and then so I just measured the number of people, the fraction of people moving into St. Louis, where I'm from 388 cities here. Now, if we completely overcome the distance, then each city should be providing the same number of people, or same fraction of people into St. Louis. So I was expecting that the dot size are going to be the same across the board. But when I summarize the result, it looks like most people moving into St. Louis are actually coming in from nearby cities. So we still recognize the distance. And I don't know exact reason why St. Louis attracts people, people coming into St. Louis is locally sourced. And then I tried this with any cities, all the 388 cities, the pattern is always the same. Most people are coming in from the nearby areas. So that kind of tells me that the distance is still a thing, because probably if you move to St. Louis, for example, if you're moving in from Memphis, then if you have option between Chicago and St. Louis, you might choose St. Louis just because it's closer. So for example, during the Thanksgiving, we can just drive down to Memphis, for example. Sure, it is true that we are reducing the barrier that we have towards distance is probably declining for sure, but still we are not completely footloose. So once again, I still have to monitor what's going to happen moving forward, but we always have to monitor the trade-off here. So hopefully that's something that we want to keep in mind moving forward, either at the intercity level or intracity level.
Okay, thanks for that. Thanks for that, Axel. I have another question that I'd like to get to. We're heading towards the end here, and I get the sense that the discussion is a little bit somber. So we have basically we have things that have been put in place in the short term, like pedestrianization in these new bike lanes and everything, that people are concerned that they won't be maintained. And that the things that could happen, so planning that would require or that would lead to further de-densification or suburbanization might actually come to play, even though we hope that it won't. It's kind of a somber stance from where I see things. But one of the questions I've been wondering a lot about myself is that supposing the big impetus we've had to use Zoom, it basically enables people to get used to working together all around the world, so that some of these driving forces for the formation of cities, that having a large specialized expert pool within a region where people can travel to, maybe all of a sudden, or maybe not so much all of a sudden, but because of Zoom, it's becoming more commonplace. We're having the possibility of having specialized and expertise from anywhere in the world to work on projects anywhere else in the world, which to me suggests that there's a possibility of a breakthrough in productivity more generally. And so maybe this is a hidden silver lining to all this. I wonder if anyone has any comments on that.
Yeah, Zach, I will take that. So yes, I think it's true that the people are finally pushed to appreciate this telecommuting, for example. But then again, there's a counter argument that the people still value face-to-face communication. So for example, one of the reasons, for example, in Silicon Valley, there's a study that shows that the knowledge transfer happens not only within the office, but people track the GPS data to see where actually exactly the knowledge transfer happens. And surprisingly, actually, informal communication that takes place at Starbucks, for example, it still has a way towards this knowledge sharing. So yeah, it's true that we are experiencing this centrifugal force pulling people away from concentration. But then I think there's still remaining value to the in face-to-face communication. So at the end of the day, it's probably still a balancing act. I agree with you, Zach, that we are moving towards decentralization, lower density configuration. But we probably want to keep in mind that there's still intrinsic value to the face-to-face communication.
Yeah, very interesting, Axel. That's interesting, and I'm actually not exactly interrupt, but I'm going to suggest another question that I think will Megan and Pierre will be able to respond to, which I think is kind of more in line with both their interests and expertise, but also in relation to the question. And so that the question of what the long-term effects of it will be. And so as planners, we've in the past few decades, there's been a lot of talk. Megan, in fact, talked about it explicitly in her introduction, or her first comment, about the degree to which telecommunications technologies might lead to flattening or a concentration, or so a flattening of the world, or a spikiness of the world. To use, so Thomas Friedman is the flattening, and then the increasing importance and concentration. I think that's Saskia Sassen. So either Pierre or Megan, what do you think? Are we headed towards more of a flattened world?
Sorry, I wish to let Megan go first if she wish, but yeah, but this is it. There are mounting empirical evidences to the effect that those technologies actually didn't entail a greater dispersion. Rather, the global scale, it entailed, like a concentration, further concentration, which is, counterintuitive. But this is documented now. But even at the local scale, and what I will bring are anecdotal evidences, but there were community groups in the Southwest Borough in Montreal who wished to map the evolution of the jobs like in their sector, and in Griffintown in particular, which is at walking distance from downtown. They realized that the fastest growing number of jobs were self-employed people working from home. And this was a surprise for everybody. And then, but it made sense, retroactively understanding, the concerns of the community, in particular those newcomers that were asking for places to meet, for places to go out and so on. So those people who by definition could be anywhere in the world, were deciding to locate downtown, and they were looking for opportunities to meet other, like outside of work, or eventually to be able to work outside of their dwelling from time to time. So this is anecdotal, but it's aligned with the biggest trend. So now I don't have the final, word on this, obviously, or final conclusions are not reached, but it's far more complex than we think. And it speaks about what the examples that Megan was given earlier, the complexity and the richness of social life in general and urban life in particular is not to be like there's no technological fix, there's no technological solution, there's no magic bullet, but we need to address this complexity, and approaches that are systemic in nature are probably better apt at considering all those aspects. And this is what is needed, in this context of trying to address, the broader challenge and the implication for the individuals and the communities,
Yeah, I think Axel brought it up too, the importance of the social as humans. Yeah, let's give you 1 second, Megan. I just wanted to put one little thought in there, which is the importance of the social as humans and in cities in particular. Megan?
Yeah, and I guess that leads me to what I was thinking here too, with respect to it. It is really not either or. And I guess I just wanted to leave on kind of thinking about senior citizens and the sort of aging perspective here, as I think, what's kind of exciting in many ways about this time is that we have seen all these new innovations in online programming, like museums, libraries, community program are really kind of being brought online. And so for those who have accessibility challenges and cannot go outside, or who don't feel safe going outside, there's more options for them. And I don't think this is going to go away. And I think that's exciting, but I still think there needs to be, home care support and, adult day programs and community centers in the neighborhood and that kind of thing. It just adds more activities sort of to the equation. But I think here we also need to think about broader issues of access, right? Around internet access, or we need to think about the digital divide in cities and then between large cities and more rural areas, right? Who has access to technology, things about training and things like this. And I think these are, issues that we saw as perhaps very kind of personal and private before. Governments have to really, really think about this.
All right, so we're coming to the end here. We have a few more minutes. What strikes me is that in these discussions that have been motivated by the pandemic itself, a lot of the answers have really revolved around existing issues in planning, existing issues that may or may not change. I didn't get the sense that there was a great feeling that this is going to change everything. And I hope I'm not reading that into it, but I wonder if you would agree with that. That basically this has highlighted a lot of the issues, the planning issues that we've been seeing in the past decades, and I'm not sure that it's going to ultimately change the evolution of things dramatically. So I'd like you to comment on that. We'll start with Megan.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I agree with that. I mean, I think, but I do think there's a lot of hope that this might enlighten what's been made invisible in pre-existing kind of planning, sorts of planning paradigms, the jobs that have been made invisible, the people that have been made invisible, the dominant planning paradigm that focuses on, high density downtown and sustainability has also not always focused on social planning and complete neighborhoods and affordability, right? And, some have critiqued this model for actually encouraging gentrification and the displacement of communities sort of downtown. So I think there's, perhaps some hope and expectation, and you need a politics to really fight, to fight for that, to make sure that these are integrated into public policies and into planning policies. So I think there's a really interesting politics there that we're starting to see happening in cities. That has always been there as well.
Thanks very much, Megan. Axel?
Yes, so I would like to shift gear a little bit towards like nationwide structure of a network here. So let me once again share something here. So I sketched the map of the United States, and each dot represents the population of each city. And as you can see, the distribution is really skewed. So New York, Los Angeles, Chicago takes the lion's share of the national population there. And then the crazy thing is that it's been like this. It applies to anywhere. Canada follows the same pattern. Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver takes up lots of population, and United States, name any country, it's the same pattern here. And then it has been in this way. It stood the test of time. So North America has experienced the drastic change in transportation. For example, we used to have only waterways, and then we have interstates, railways, and affordable airliners. But no matter what kind of change tossed into the distribution, it remains the same. It's really skewed. So I'm really excited to see what this pandemic does to this distribution. Would that stand the test of time even with the pandemic? So are we going to have a drastic change to the distribution? I'm leaning towards that it's probably not going to change much. It's going to stay there because it has been in this way. But I would like to come back and visit this distribution again, maybe in 10 years' time, to see what happens to the distribution as well as what happens within the city.
Very interesting point, Axel. Thanks very much. Looks like Pierre, you'll have the last word on all this. What do you think?
Well, no, I think that the current crisis reveals vulnerabilities, many of which were known, very, or sometimes known only by specialists and so on. So it's useful in that sense, and I think that it calls for building resilience, which is a term that I don't like that much, but that is useful. It captures, but that could translate, in more positive terms into increasing quality of life. And this is what those challenges, like allow us to move towards increasing quality of life and social equity and intergenerational equity and so on and so forth. Those ethics challenges, and are revealed, and they're very easy to see by everybody. So that could be very good. I think that atomization, either through transportation infrastructure or like going online systematically and so on, is not the solution. It doesn't address the complexity of social life and interactions. It's not even aligned with the long-term trends, and more recent trends, where those technology were supposed to lead to. I think that there were other forces that propel those models, and those forces are the very one that need to be fought, in the context of climate change. And there are alternative models, and there are models that would allow to embrace, like complexity. And I think that this little discussion is pointing to a couple of such issues. It was very interesting. I want to thank my colleagues, actually.
And yeah, I'll take the opportunity too to thank all of you. I thought the discussion was very rich. I was glad to be able to have some interaction also with the Q&As, which I think we're right on. And with that, I will thank Megan, Pierre, and Axel for their participation, and thank Fourth Space once again for asking us to put this together, and also for hosting it. I think it was really a very interesting discussion.
Thank to Zachary as well.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Zach. You took the words out of my mouth. So really, on behalf of all of us at Fourth Space, we would like to thank Megan, Axel, Pierre for your considered and super engaging insights. And Zachary, this balancing act of moderating and contributing to the conversation at the same time, expertly done. So thank you very much. There's so many questions. Obviously, we could have kept going for another hour, but I thank you all for attending and invite you to take one more minute of your time to give us a little bit of feedback on the survey that I've pasted in the chat, and that will also appear as you leave the webinar. Check us out on social media at CU Fourth Space and our website, concordia.ca/4, to access the upcoming events that we have lined up for you all and the archives of recent conversations, much like today's. So once again, it looks like the sun might be coming out. I hope you all get outdoors and enjoy some of this beautiful summertime that we have access to right now. Happy June, everyone, and we'll see you soon. Thanks a lot.